And I'm very happy to have you here for this special event commemorating the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. We're lucky to have 3 speakers today. First will be Gilbert Tauber, who's an urban planner and historian, to talk about the history of the park and the area. And then we have Al Burr of Friends of Straus Park, who talk about more of what Friends of Straus Park does for the park and the current history of the park. Then we have Brett Gladstone, who's actually the great-great-grandson of Isidor and Ida Strauss, to talk about more of the history of the Strauses. So with that, we'll get started with Gilbert, and we hope you enjoy yourselves.
Okay, I've been asked to talk about the history of Straus Park, and so we'll begin with Bloomingdale. As many of you may know, we're in a part of Manhattan that used to be called Bloomingdale, and if you came here along that sidewalk of Broadway, you were actually in the bed of the old Bloomingdale Road. Now, Bloomingdale, obviously, it comes from a Dutch name, of Bloemendaal, which means Vale of Flowers, and the name conjures up perhaps images of rosy-cheeked children and wooden shoes. But the fact is that there was no settlement at all up here in Dutch times. It was, for one thing, very dangerous because some of the Dutch governors had provoked wars with the Indians. It was remote and hard to get to. And most of all, it was an area not particularly suited for agriculture. In a time when nearly all goods moved by boat, it was very important for farmers and for practically anybody to be near water. The east side of Manhattan is lower and flatter than the west side, and it has many more creeks and indentations where you could pull in a boat. The west side, by contrast, in the whole stretch from, let's say, Midtown up to 125th Street, there's only one decent cove, and that is the one at the foot of 96th Street that later came to be known as Stryker's Bay. And even there, the slope up from the river is a pretty steep climb for man or beast. And so the early development of Manhattan tended to be along the east shore, and the west side here was pretty much neglected. Okay, 1664, the British take over New York. 4 years later, a well-connected merchant and colonial official by the name of Isaac Bellov receives a grant of land that includes the area we are now standing on. If the name Bellov means, rings any bell with you, you may be old enough to remember when Liberty Island was called Bedloe's Island. That's something else he once owned. Bellov was kind of a wheeler dealer. He was a very clever man, but he did one very stupid thing in 1673. He died without leaving the will. His heirs were besieged by debtors. The estate was tied up for years, And it was not until 1688, probably, that his former patent was purchased by a farmer named Tunis Ida. Tunis had a farm down in what is now Greenwich Village. And probably in the spring of 1689, he moved up to the Upper West Side, and he built himself a house on the north side of that cove at 96th Street. He was probably the first permanent settler of what we now call the Upper West Side, or at least of this Bloomingdale area. Tunis owned a stretch of land that went from 89th Street to 107th Street, the north end of this park, and went inland as far as well into Central Park. And as time went on, he acquired some additional land to the south, so that he owned a total of 460 acres of land. Over a period of years, with his son and his sons-in-law, he cut down the trees and he sold them for lumber. And once the land, as he cleared the land, he planted fruit trees, and then he sold his fruit. And whatever Tunis Ida bought or sold in those early years had to be moved by boat. At this time, there was a road up the east side of Manhattan. It was a former Indian trail that the colonists, both British and Dutch before them, had widened into a road that was wide enough for wagons and such, and that came to be known as the Eastern Coast Road. However, there was nothing comparable when Tunis moved here on the west side. Around 1700, the colonial authorities began to see the need for a road up the west side, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One, of course, was to encourage settlement, but the other consideration was military. In 1702 or so, Britain was once again at war with France in what was known as Queen Anne's War. And there was some concern that there might be a strike by the French down from their possessions in Canada down the Hudson Valley. And so it was a good idea to have some better access to the Upper West Side. And so a road was planned that branched off the existing post road at what is now Madison Square and meandered up the west side, ending initially at what is now 114th Street and Riverside Drive. It was later extended. The records are sketching that that road was probably started in 1708 and then again gradually widened to take wagons and farmers' carts. And the route for most of its length was approximately that of the present Broadway. And the road, of course, greatly increased the value of land up here. And in 1720, Tunis Ida had a surveyor come up here and subdivide his land into 8 lots, some of which he transferred to his family members, sons and sons-in-law, and the others of which he sold. And so, thanks to the Bloomingdale Road, Tunis Ida reaped his richest harvest. By the middle of the 18th century, Bloomingdale was a choice location for the country estates of the wealthy. There were the Lanceys up here, there were Schuyler's, there were the Peisters, various other families whose names were prominent in New York history. In 1764, a farm running from the Bloomingdale Road, which was right there, westward to the river, was sold to a merchant named Nicholas Jones. Some years later, in 1776, this Jones farm was the site of a significant engagement in the Battle of Harlem Heights. The invading British were pursuing Washington's army up the Bloomingdale Road, and as night fell, the Americans dug in on the high ground north of the Hollow Way, that valley where 125th Street runs now. Under cover of darkness, an American detachment worked its way down along the shore, attacked the British, in the field right around the Jones house. But greatly outnumbered, they were driven back. The British halted their pursuit just north of what's now Grant's Tomb. The British sounded a fox hunting call. They had their buglers.
Oh, that's why we can't hear you. The fox hunting call.
A fox hunting call.
That's why we can't hear you.
That's it. Which was intended by the British and was taken by the Americans as an insult. Washington was aroused to try a risky ploy. He sent a group of volunteers into the Hollow Way to lure the British down there. And the British took the bait and were nearly trapped by Washington's forces. Both sides called in reinforcements, which in the ensuing battle involved 1,800 American troops and 5,000 British. In the end, the British took far higher casualties than the Americans and had to withdraw when they ran out of ammunition. Of course, the Americans were still retreating. It was not really a great victory, but it was a terrific morale booster for the American troops, the American cause, and probably for Washington himself. In later years, by the way, the Jones house was bought by a prominent manufacturer of patent medicines by the name of Moffitt, and a little later it became a hotel known as the Woodlawn, and it stood on that block until the 1890s. Now, in the early years of the 19th century, 3 villages appeared along the Bloomingdale Road. One was Harsonville, which was around 71st Street. The next was Bloomingdale Village, which was in the upper 90s, not far from Stryker's Bay. And the third was Manhattanville. As time went on, the larger country estates tended to be broken up, and usually what would happen is that the owners kept the part near the river, which had the better views, and sold off or leased the parts back from the river. In 1818, the New York Hospital, which was down near City Hall, was seeking a quiet location for what today would be called its psychiatric department. It bought the inland portion of the DePeister farm, and it opened a new facility in 1821, which came to be known as the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. Over the next few decades, additional charitable institutions were located in Bloomingdale, but the insane asylum was by far the largest and best known for most of the 19th century. The city's Board of Aldermen was being driven crazy because each landowner, they would lay out streets, name them after themselves and their children, and however, these street plans didn't mesh, and it was a terrible headache. So, in effect, the city kicked the problem upstairs and asked the state legislature to appoint a commission to lay out the undeveloped part of Manhattan Island. That commission was appointed in 1807, and they had 4 years to do their job, and they brought it in before the deadline in 1811. And that is the commissioner's plan that has been the basis of Manhattan's street system to the present day. The plan covered all of the undeveloped area of Manhattan, from Houston Street up to, at least in its initial form, to 155th Street. There was no Central Park, of course, the plan did call for a handful of smaller parks, plus a large marketplace, a site for an astronomical observatory, and a parade ground for military exercise. The commissioners explained that they relied on the large arms of the sea on either side of the island to provide adequate ventilation. Within the area covered by the plan, all of the old roads, including the Bloomingdale Road, were supposed to be obliterated. However, it wasn't very long before this proved to be a problem, especially with Bloomingdale Road. It wasn't already an important traffic artery leading up to the only bridge at the northern tip of the island. And there was a lot of investment in buildings along it, and it would be years before the new avenues would be able to replace it. The result was that the plan was gradually amended, each time restoring and extending another few blocks of the Bloomingdale Road, putting it back in the plan, usually by making it an extension of Broadway. Central Park, as you know, was added to the plan in the 1850s, while some of the nearby smaller parks shown on the 1811 plan were eliminated. One of those was the original Bloomingdale Square, which ran from 53rd to 57th Streets between 8th and 9th Avenue. That was closed in 1857. It took many years before the plan had any visible effect on the Upper West Side. At the close of the Civil War, most of the crosstown streets and even some of the avenues were still no more than lines on a map. When the Strauses moved here in 1872, this was still really more or less open country. Nevertheless, both city officials and local property owners foresaw severe problems in imposing the grid on the rocky and rugged terrain of the Upper West Side and northern Manhattan, and there were calls to drastically revise the grid plan in this area. The most important advocate of these revisions was Andrew Haswell Green. Anybody recognize that name?
Yeah, sure.
Good for you. He was one of the most important public servants in the history of this city. Later on, he became the guy who devised the plan for combining the 5 boroughs into Greater New York. He conceived the park system in the Bronx, but at this time, he was the treasurer and controller of the commissioners of the Central Park Commission, in which capacity, by the way, he had been essentially the boss of Olmsted and Vaux when they designed Central Park. Andrew Haswell Green was among the strongest proponents of relaying out this area. And at the time, New York had no such thing as a city planning department. But what it did have was the Central Park Commission. It had engineers, it had landscape architects, it had other professionals, and it had just successfully carried out one of the most complex public works projects in American history, including miles of roads and dozens of bridges. Green persuaded the state legislature to turn the job of revising the street plan over to his commission. And by the way, I think in this you can see how Green can be in some respects compared to Robert Moses, but, minus the megalomania. So this revision of the street plan, this was legislation passed in 1865-66. Within a few years, it led to the creation of Riverside Park, Riverside Drive, Morningside Park, St. Nicholas Park, Colonial Park, St. Nicholas Avenue, the Harlem River Drive, and most importantly for our subject today, the laying out of what was then called the Boulevard, a broad new road which replaced the old Bloomingdale Road from 59th Street up to its junction with what was then 11th Avenue, right here at 107th Street. And that, of course, is what created the little triangle that we are in today. It took a few more years before some of the other streets around us were visible on the ground. 11th Avenue, which we now called West End Avenue, was opened up here on 107th Street only in 1874. And 106th and 107th Streets between Broadway and Riverside Drive were not opened until 1884. So you see, this was rather late to develop. Regarding 11th Avenue, this may be the place to mention that even before the closing of Bloomingdale Road in 1868, the name Bloomingdale Road had become problematic for the people who were interested in selling real estate up here because it was so closely associated with the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. After all, even today, landlords in the East 20s don't boast of their, proximity to Bellevue. As an alternative, local boosters promoted a new name for the neighborhood. The West End, of course, has overtones of this, fashionable part of London. They formed a civic group called the West End Association. And in 1880, they got the city to change the name of 11th Avenue to West End Avenue, above 59th Street. The name was quickly adopted by the press and used by a number of businesses and institutions, including the West End Presbyterian Church, which is at 105th Street. The process of rebranding seemed to be complete in 1894, when, after selling its property to Columbia University, the Bloomingdale Asylum itself departed for Westchester County. So now you know where the Bloomingdale Asylum was. This triangle here was acquired by the city and turned over to the Parks Department in 1895. And for a while, it's just referred to in the Parks Department documents as Triangle at 106th Street. But then it appears as Schuyler Square, and that name also appears on real estate maps and newspaper articles. Now, the Schuylers were a prominent New York family. There was a General Schuyler in the American Revolution, General Philip Schuyler. There was his daughter, who was the wife of Alexander Hamilton, and who was a founder of the St. Michael's Episcopal Church at 99th Street, back when telephone exchanges had names. Some of us can remember that. One of the exchanges in this area was Schuyler 4, which I think derives from Schuyler Square. Now, getting back to Bloomingdale, there was a Bloomingdale Dutch Reformed Church at Harsonville, that village down in the 70s, which was one of the West Side's leading churches for most of the 19th century. In 1884, it built a large new building on the new Broadway at 68th Street. In 1900, its minister resigned, basically in disagreement with the church's doctrine, which I'm not qualified to talk about, but he resigned and he joined the Baptists. Some of the members then wanted to merge with a nearby Congregational church, but that was rejected by the Reformed Church governing body, the Classes, which found the church had recruited a new minister and offered financial aid. And still the church struggled. Now, as you know, we're at the time when the original IRT subway was being built along Broadway. It was opened in 1904, but well before that, the subway had set off a building boom along the west side. In 1905, the Bloomingdale Reformed Church entered into a complex real estate transaction in which it sold its property at 68th Street to a developer. In exchange, it received 5 lots on West End Avenue facing Schuyler Square. 2 of those 5 lots were then transferred to the owner of an existing 5-story building at the corner, which was demolished, creating the site for the present Stanley Court. And Stanley Court was, by the way, the very first large apartment building, the first 12-story apartment building on West End Avenue, and it set the pattern for a great deal of what was to come in the following year. The remaining 3 lots became the new site of the Bloomingdale Reformed Church. And interestingly, the broker involved in these transactions was Charles E. Schuyler. A new church, including costly stained glass windows by John Lafarge, opened the following year. And in its honor, the city changed the name of this little park from Schuyler Square to Bloomingdale Square. So this was the Manhattan's second square called Bloomingdale Square. However, the church failed to thrive at its new location. 2 years later, it's apparently closed, and its building was leased out to a synagogue. A 1909 real estate atlas shows it as Temple Isaiah. In 1913, the building was sold outright to a developer who replaced it with the present apartment building at 949 West End Avenue. Interestingly, the architects of that building were Schwartz and Gross, who were also the architects of the building that stands on the site of the former Straus house at the other end of this block. The closing of the church, in effect, made Bloomingdale Square available for renaming. Only 5 months after the Titanic disaster, on September 24th, 1912, the Board of Aldermen renamed this park to honor Isidor and Ida Straus. Although it was known as Bloomingdale Square for only a few years, this was enough to trigger a small revival of a name that had formerly been an embarrassment. As a result, we still have in this area a Bloomingdale school, a Bloomingdale public library, and the Bloomingdale House of Music. In 1913, a year after the renaming, the Parks Department reported the acceptance of a proposed memorial to the Strauses to be presented by a committee of citizens. That monument was dedicated on this date in 1915. And at this point, I think it's time for me to pass the oratorical baton to Albert.
Okay, I'll be much briefer. Briefer word. Not it is not. All right. So the park was dedicated, and I have a photograph of that very day. I'll pass it around. Photograph of the April 15 event. And during the succeeding years, the park got to be very, very popular with people in the neighborhood. And if I can extricate this, another photograph that the Straus Historical Society, of which I'm on the board. And this is a photograph of the park showing you the different configuration of the park. This picture was taken in 1935, and you see that there's a different configuration of the paths and of the park benches and so on. But it was a popular park. As time went on, it became shabby and a home for quote, undesirables. And so in the mid-90s, 1990s, the West 106th Street Block Association, which was chaired by Leon Auerbach, who used to live on 106th Street. Some of you may remember him and know him. Convinced the city and the Department of Parks to reconstitute the park and reclaim it from the so-called undesirables. And in the reconstitution of the park was extended so that West End Avenue, this block of West End Avenue, was narrowed so that motorists coming down Broadway from the north could more easily make the distinction between Broadway and West End. And the park is now what we know it. And when the park was completed in 1997, I think almost $1 million, I think that's right. The Friends of Straus Park, a non-profit organization, was established. I'm on the board of the Friends of Straus Park. I've been on the board since 1997. The president is Kate Ford. I'm not sure she's here. The secretary is Marge Kavanaugh. The treasurer is Dee Wolf. I'm not sure they're here. They said they might be here at this time. We are a non-profit organization, and we welcome contributions at any time. This is the Straus home at Broadway and West 106th Street. Behind that building. Behind this building, as he says, that's right. Now I'll introduce Brett Gladstone, who has come to the city from where he lives in San Francisco, and we are eager to hear him speak about the family because he is the great-grandson of Isidor and Ida Strauss.
Oh.
Thank you. I'm really very, very happy to be here and to come back to see my family. I grew up in Manhattan, and I would like to tell you all how proud I am of my great-great-grandparents and so honored that all of you came here today. And please let me know if you can't hear me. I continue to be astounded that with all the heroic people and events of the last century, that their heroic last moments continue to be portrayed over and over again, and such attention paid to it by the public. First of all, our family would like to thank Landmarks West for organizing this. And I'd like to thank the fellow board members of the Straus Historical Association and its president, Paul Kurzman, my uncle. You may have seen him in People magazine last week where he was portrayed as a descendant and showed off a locket belonging to my great-great-grandfather whose body was recovered. Paul's the president of our association, and he's speaking today at various events around the country, including the Titanic Museum in Tennessee. I'd also like to thank Al and Friends of Straus Park for their wonderful job in maintaining this beautiful park and the tulips today. I'd like to thank Joan Adler. I don't know if she's here today. She'll be here later, and she is the family historian who has traced the family and its history starting in 1948 when the family came here from Germany, and she's traced the history of hundreds of years before, 1858. And she's traced the German history before that. And she's published a number of articles. She publishes our newsletter, and she arranged a wonderful event the other night at the Macy's Board of Directors offices, where Macy's put on a cocktail party in honor of my great-great-grandparents, and I wanted to thank Macy's as well. As you may know, the Strauss brothers moved here in 1848, lived in the South. They were peddlers in the South after after the Civil War in which they participated. Their town was decimated by the Union troops, and they moved to Philadelphia, and then they moved to New York, where they stayed, and they became partners. First, they opened up a little China concession. China was their business, in a small haberdashery store on 34th Street owned by a retired sea captain named R.H. Macy. R.H. Macy then died, and he died in 1877. And in 1888, the Strauss brothers became majority interest in Macy's and started to build the many buildings that exist there today on 34th Street. After Isidor's death, their children and their children's children took over the store, which the Strauss family continued to run until almost the third quarter of the last century, something like perhaps 80 years. Now, as you probably know, my great-great-grandparents' last hours on Earth have been portrayed in at least 2 or 3 Hollywood movies, 3 TV series, a Broadway musical, poems, books, and thousands of articles. And today, Titanic museums around the country draw enormous crowds who want to learn about the ship and the Strauses and the others who have tragically lost their lives. But for me, as a child growing up in Manhattan in the 1960s, where there were few good role models and a lot of cynicism about our leaders and few heroes, my great-great-grandparents served for me, well, it had some special meaning. Their lives had a lot of meaning to me. And it was humbling as a kid to walk by this park and the monuments around the city for them and the 2 schools named after them, and to see the plaque at Macy's in their honor. And my family's repeated stories about their philanthropy and their good deeds, including Isidor's many years of selfless government service when he was a member of Congress representing New York, and as an advisor to mayors, governors, and presidents, even while running the great store with his brothers. And those wonderful stories imbued me, inspired me with, as someone who was the hope-for future lawyer in the family, with a great drive to succeed and honor their legacy and name. As is typical, every generation puts in the next generation its great hopes, and I was blessed by wonderful educational and cultural opportunities that my great-great-grandparents made possible for me and my family. And as an adult, when I matured enough to understand the importance of a long-term life partnership, it was the strength of Isidor and Ida that impressed me a great deal. In fact, Isidor and Ida were known to write each other every day of their lives that they were apart. And of course, in the final hours, preferred to die together rather than living apart. Can all you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it's their last moments together, of course, that capture the imagination of so many. And for that reason, I'll talk a little bit about their last hour, as witnessed by their maid, Ellen Bird, who survived to tell their story to my great-grandmother, Sarah, who then told it to me.
Wow.
As one of the last lifeboats was boarding, a ship officer asked Ida to get into the boat, at which point she refused and insisted that their maid, Ellen Bird, take her place in boat number 8. When it became apparent that there was no hope of staying afloat, her husband, Isidor, insisted again, and in fact, a crewman started to force her entry into lifeboat number 8. She entered thinking her husband would step in next. In fact, the inference was that Isidor, her husband, pretended to get in, hoping that she would. In fact, he did not get in, and as the lifeboat began descending, Ida realized he was not getting in. She jumped out of the boat to join her husband. At that point, according to the maid, Ellen Bird, she spoke the following words to her husband. "We have been together a long time. I will not leave you. Where you go, I shall go." At that point, Ida tossed her fur coat into the arms of Ellen Bird, who lived to tell the story. You may have seen the most recent Titanic movie by James Cameron, which came back recently in 3D. And in that, he portrays my great-great-grandparents as an old couple in black, hugging in bed as the water rises around the bed. Actually, that's apocryphal, and the eyewitnesses recall that the last time they were seen was holding each other, sitting in a deck chair. At the time, a great wave came over them. Back in New York, Ellen Bird handed the fur coat to my great-grandmother, Sarah, who then handed it back to Ellen, saying that her mother, Ida, would have preferred that Ellen keep it. A memorial service for my great-great-grandparents was held in Carnegie Hall on May 12th. It was reported that 6,000 people attended that service, and tens of thousands were reported to have been turned away, and thereafter attended services at other locations in the city. On April 24, 1912, the New York Tribune reported, the New York newspaper reported that a crowd estimated to be 40,000 people gathered to attend a lecture outdoors on Isidor Straus. and for fear that a mob would rush in, the police had to order the meeting abandoned. And now about the park. Within months thereafter, as Al mentioned, and is mentioned here in the plaque before me, a memorial committee was formed to collect contributions to create the park we stand in today. And with the citizens' generosity, this park was dedicated April 15, 1915, excuse me. My great-great-grandfather's body was discovered floating in the seas, and the locket he held remains today with my Uncle Paul. Those of you who may have seen People magazine last week in National Geographic, you would see a photo of that locket. Ida's body was never recovered. She is not here. And perhaps the historian before might tell you who is depicted here. Apparently it was a famous model of that day, whose name escapes me. Anyone remember?
Audrey Munson.
Audrey Hudson.
Munson. M-U-N-S-O-N.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And my great-great-grandfather is buried at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where unfortunately I buried my mother last September 11 nearby. Ida's memorialized here by the beautiful statue you see, which is named Memory, and it was done by the sculptor Augustus Luckman. According to an account of the time from a book called Elegant New York, Mr. Luckman's work was chosen in a competition, and the reason it was chosen, and I quote that book, the statue represented a scheme of peaceful contemplation over a sheet of water, leaving it to the meditative public to muse over the sacrifice the same element demanded of the Titanic disaster, unquote. Those of you who afterward will look at this wall with its gold inscription, you will read the inscription from the Old Testament, and what it states is, quote, "In memory of Isidor and Ida Straus, lovely and pleasant were they in their lives, and in their death they were not divided." From Book 11, Samuel. As you know, Isidor honored the unwritten and now lost tradition of women and children first. And Ida, in a world perhaps even more so today, where commitments were often brief and somewhat fragile, herself followed the Old Testament commandment and tradition best portrayed by the Old Testament's book of Ruth. As you may recall, at a most difficult time in her life, Ruth stayed close and loyal to her family, saying, "Entreat me not to leave you, for where thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge, and where thou diest, I will die, and there I will be buried." As you've heard before, this location was chosen for the park because Isidor and Ida had a beautiful home just behind this building at 2745 Broadway. That's the location where you'll find Henry's Restaurant. And about 3:30 today, as I mentioned, Friends of Straus Park will have an event here. And after that, many of us will be heading over to Henry's and welcome to answer any questions you may have. Finally, I'd like to again thank Landmarks West to allow me to come today and speak on behalf of the Straus family. Nothing gives me more pleasure than the opportunity to speak of my great-great-grandparents. A couple who had everything and yet surrendered their lives to abide by principle and to affirm their loving and everlasting bond to each other. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Friends of Straus Park's 100th anniversary celebration of the sinking of the Titanic today. We didn't expect such a huge crowd today. We're so glad everybody showed up. Friends of Straus Park has been instrumental in taking care of the park over the years. We were also instrumental in getting it rehabbed a few years ago with Leon Auerbach, who was our president. And he took great strides with the city government and the state and government to get the funds available for the parks to be rehabbed. And this is the result that you see today. It's a beautiful park. We take care of the flowers and the plants, and we try to keep the park as clean as possible. John Olam couldn't be here today. He's our horticulturist, but I'm taking his place, and we're planting 2 trees in memory of Isidor and Ida Strauss. They are red buds, and the reason why we picked them is because they will do well under the shade of all the other trees that are in the park today. But they also have heart-shaped leaves, which are a symbol of the love Isidor and Ida Strauss had for each other when they gave up their place on the safety boats to go to live a full life. They already did that, so they wanted to live together in their last moments on the boat. We're going to be lighting candles now and playing a song from the ship. It's called Dream of Autumn, the day the ship went down. Start the candles.
The trees have heart-shaped leaves, and that's why they pick them for love.